You're tuned to the Voice of Russia. I'm Howell Davis, and you're listening to today's debate. Last Sunday night, the closing ceremony of the Paralympic Games was held, marking the end of Britain's spectacular Olympic summer. While the impact of the able-bodied Olympics may have been expected, the popularity of the Paralympics perhaps came as more of a surprise, with record crowds, record TV audiences, and widespread admiration for the efforts of the athletes themselves. So have the Games changed perceptions towards disability for good in the UK? To answer that question, I'm joined now by Neil Coyle, Director of Policy and Campaigns at Disability Rights UK, Jodie McIntyre, journalist and author of the Life on Wheels blog, and Jonathan Freedland, a Guardian columnist. If I might start with you, Neil, do you think these Games might have a permanent effect on British ideas of disability?
We very much hope so, Disability Rights UK, and obviously there was an absolutely fantastic reaction to GB hosting the Paralympics. The first time sales for Paralympic sports events have sold out. The public reaction has been absolutely fantastic. We genuinely hope there's a full legacy there. We've produced a London 2012 guide to making sports more accessible generally, that it seems to be very popular online. We hope that'll last. We hope sports clubs will change how they make their premises and events accessible to disabled people as spectators as well as participants. So we are hopeful that there'll be a positive reaction, and including in how society generally sees disabled people, taking away the idea that all disabled people are somehow inherently vulnerable. You cannot watch wheelchair rugby and make that assumption any longer.
Jodie, do you worry that this will be a one-off thing and the impact will fade over time quite quickly?
I think the Paralympics were a hugely positive event. It was amazing to see the best of disabled athletes from all over the world competing. However, it would be naive to suggest that attitudes towards disabilities and prejudice towards disabled people is going to end after 11 days of sporting events. And what is really important to consider is after the mass hysteria, if you like, of the Olympics and Paralympics has died down, what is the concrete reality of the situation that disabled people face in England and the UK? Today, we have a situation where the government wants to cut 20% of disability benefits when, by their own figures, not by my opinion, by their own figures, only 0.3% of applications are fraudulent. And we also have a situation where, whilst we are living in one of the most diverse cities in the world that hosted the Paralympics, let's have a look at our public transport system. Most train stations and tube stations are completely inaccessible. So if you're a disabled person living in London and you wanted to go and watch these amazing Paralympics that we were hosting, you wouldn't even be able to get onto the tube if you wanted to go and watch them. So I think it's better to focus on the concrete reality.
Jonathan, do you think there's a danger in which we're too self-congratulatory about this? There's a golden glow about the Games and we're not actually dealing with the concrete issues that Jodie has just outlined.
There's certainly that danger that you do just have this sort of warm bath of good feeling and say, right, tick, we've done that. We're obviously a terribly enlightened society, and aren't we great? And then you forget about the really concrete issues that Jodie has rightly alerted us to. And when I wrote about this, I did make some of those points, that the discrimination hasn't gone away, that benefits are being cut, that access in London in particular, is said to be terrible. So all of that's true. But what I would say is, in order to get change on exactly those points, the disabled rights movement and activists need allies, and what the Paralympic Games may have done, and the public reaction to the Paralympic Games, is to have woken up a whole lot of people who otherwise may have either been unaware or frankly not interested in these issues to now be strongly aware of them. I mean, people used to talk about consciousness raising back in the 60s, and I think that's what this has done in a huge way, so that now if somebody wants to make the kind of argument Jodie's just made and will then attach to it a line which says, you know, if you want to have the David Weirs or Hannah Cockcrofts of the future, these are great Paralympic athletes, then they will, you know, you're not going to get them if you cut off this benefit or deny access to this, community centre or facility, then suddenly that argument will get an audience that previously it wouldn't have got. There is a huge now sort of public sentiment that can be tapped into by activists like Jodie, and that wasn't there, I don't think, before. And so that's the change. In other words, in and of itself, it doesn't mean all these problems have gone away, far from it, but now I think there's a degree of sort of awareness, and I think that becomes quite hard for the government and others to get away with the kind of changes they might have made before, because now there will be that public opinion shift, and that's the big change.
Neil's trying to come in here now.
We're already seeing the sort of champions of particular causes, Paralympians who are speaking out about the same changes to support that Jodie's mentioned. You know, people who are saying they would not have been able to compete in the Paralympics without the kind of support that the government is now withdrawing. So that kind of championing of issues is already coming to the fore, if you like. There are other concerns. I mean, having had such a positive reaction to the Paralympics, it's interesting to see if we'll see a shift in press coverage more generally of some of the changes that the government's announcing, because there's been a misunderstanding in the press. The press have very much gone on that whole scrounger fraud type justification for such radical cuts in support for disabled people. We're hoping that we'll see a shift in how the British press in particular report welfare and the changes to support that disabled people are going to be experiencing.
Jodie?
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to disagree with what Jonathan has said. Before I make my point, I'd just like to use one example to back this up that I had recently. Of course, most tube stations are completely inaccessible to wheelchair users. However, there are some stations where the platform to street is accessible, but the train to platform is inaccessible, i.e. there is a large step from the train to the platform. Now, to get around this problem, for the period of the Paralympics, makeshift ramps were brought in to help that transition from train to platform. However, there were also problems. You had to book it far in advance, etc., etc. However, after the Paralympics, these ramps are being taken out, and this highlights exactly what I'm saying. Now, Jonathan was saying that the Paralympics will raise the consciousness, etc. My opinion is, look, the Paralympics takes place every 4 years and has done for a very long time. Every 4 years, not only at the Olympics but at the Paralympics, we see the best athletes from all over the world. I don't think that the fact that it's being held in Britain should make any difference to that, and to me this highlights an underlying theory of somehow these games are better than all of the other ones that have taken place because they took place in London.
Could I come back on that?
Of course, Jonathan.
I don't think, and people who've been at these previous Paralympiads, previous Paralympic tournaments do back me up on this, I don't think there's ever been a public reaction comparable to the one that happened here. I mean, that's just borne out by ticket sales alone. There were full houses at every venue, 2.5 million tickets sold for Paralympic events. That has never happened before. In Beijing, the stadiums were sometimes half full, and those were people, they had to give away those tickets, and people were sort of more or less compelled to come, school groups, etc. This time, the entire British public has voted with its wallets, if you like, and came out, and it was on wall-to-wall TV coverage, etc. Now, that is unusual. It certainly, for example, didn't happen just example off the top of my head, Atlanta 1996. I know how apathetic the Americans were because I was in America for the first few days of the Paralympics this time, and they were completely ignored, not televised, not written about in the newspapers. So the British reaction was specific, unusual, and I would say to Britain's credit. Now that, I think, is a foundation to build on. The fact that the British public did engage, did wake up to this, issues, the kind of issues that for Jodie have been familiar for years and decades. Suddenly, a whole lot of other people, perhaps they should have been aware of them much, much sooner, but now they are, and therefore I think there is absolutely a moment here for campaigners like him to build on, because they will get a hearing now in a way that they wouldn't have done before, and I would say they wouldn't get in other countries because this same kind of wake-up didn't happen there and hasn't happened there.
You're tuned to The Voice of Russia. I'm Howell Davis, and today we're debating whether the Paralympic Games have changed perceptions towards disability for good in the UK. I'm joined by Neil Coyle, Director of Policy and Campaigns at Disability Rights UK, Jodie McIntyre, a journalist and author of the Life on Wheels blog, and Jonathan Friedland, a columnist for The Guardian newspaper. Sorry, Neil.
Yeah, I was just going to say about obviously the TV coverage is absolutely fantastic. Paralympics, Channel 4 did an absolutely amazing job.
But the BBC didn't host it, which it did for the able-bodied Olympics.
I think there were different bidding systems. I don't really know, but for the purpose of this discussion, the coverage was excellent. Did have high viewing figures.
I've heard otherwise, to be honest.
But I think what disabled people are also saying is that what they want to see is sustained coverage of disability sports generally, not just a flash in the pan. Let's just do it for the Paralympics, have super coverage now and then nothing for another 4 years, and that's perhaps a more lively concern, and also that there is this a perception now that somehow that you have to be superhuman to be accepted almost, just as most non-disabled people aren't Olympians, most non-disabled people aren't Paralympians, and it's that there are disabled people who are suggesting that they're now being held up to an even higher degree, which almost justifies some of the cuts in support that the government have been pursuing. The fact that very senior members of the government were booed at the Paralympics, and we didn't see that at the Olympics, is another indicator of the fact that there are people who are watching, people who paid to go and see Paralympics, who are aware that the opportunities for disabled people in the future are being rescinded, and that exposure is incredibly helpful. Like Jonathan's saying about it, but just exposing the fact that disabled people are the hardest hit. There is a campaign in the UK being run called The Hardest Hit, which we're part of at Disability Rights UK, because of the vast number of cuts in support that are going on, disabled people are at the front line. It's if you can't cut a council's expenditure, for example, you can't cut the funding for a council without a knock-on effect on social care, which supports disabled people. The disability benefits, Jodie's already mentioned. I mean, there is more coming from disabled people's direct financial support per year in the government cuts than will be taken from the banking levy.
Jonathan, does this perhaps sort of expose how we're being slightly hypocritical here, the wider world, in that people are willing to pump $9 billion into the Olympics? That sort of money is being cut from benefits for disabled people.
No, I don't for a minute deny that, and I agree about how telling it was that George Osborne got booed. Incidentally, no other politicians appeared in that role in the Olympic Games. They weren't handing out medals, so it's hard to test, but it was very specific. I agree, the anger towards George Osborne, and I think it was the Chancellor of the Exchequer here in Britain, and I think it was because he was held responsible for cutting benefits and other important things to disabled people. So I think that's where that was coming from. So I think that, there's a false dichotomy here, which is either you're saying this is a magic wand and everything is solved overnight, or somehow nothing will change. And I think it's possible to say something in between has happened here, which is there is an opening, there is a possibility, a huge degree of not just public sort of sympathy, perhaps in an earlier era even pity. That's not what I'm talking about. Actually, quite the opposite. what the Paralympics brought out was a degree of kind of respect. There was a sort of mutual respect. That's what I felt. I was at the Paralympic Games day after day because I was writing on it, and I felt there was this. It wasn't the old story of sort of, aren't they brave, triumph over tragedy. There was great respect being shown by people who are not disabled towards people who are disabled, and to be in that crowd of 80,000 people cheering themselves hoarse for disabled people who we know from the kind of writing that Jodie and others do are often either ignored, that's almost at best, or sometimes mocked and abused in the streets. That is a huge moment in the national life, and I don't think it should be belittled. It's a big thing, and now the challenge is to turn that into support for example, blocking and opposing those changes to benefits that are being proposed by the government. So that's a big thing. I would also just say instantly about the China thing. It's quite true. Good for China for support for Paralympic sport, but in terms of medals per head of population, Britain just way out in front. So by miles. So I just don't think we should. I think there's anything to be gained by somehow suggesting that in that area, in terms of support for the sport and for the Paralympic Games, Britain was in any way lacking. Jodie's argument and Neil's argument, I think, is much stronger when you say, okay, that was good. Now what we do is translate that support into people who are not, as he said, not athletes or not interested in sport, who are just living their day-to-day lives. And I think that's a much more powerful argument than any kind of attempt to sort of play down or deny that something rather special did happen during those 10 days, because I think it just clearly did.
Jodie, is there overemphasis perhaps on the physical side of being disabled, not enough on sort of how disabled people might have sort of mental attributes that could be used by the wider world?
Obviously, we need to recognise that disabled people can make achievements in all areas and not only sport. But an argument I'm hearing here and I've heard before, which is that this has raised public consciousness, as Jonathan was saying, and that can be translated into stopping the government from taking these actions. If you are of the opinion that the government are taking measures and that can change by the result of the next election, then this would be considered a step. However, what I have noticed, and what I think is becoming abundantly clear, is that the three major political parties in this country, on the issue of making cuts, including to disability benefits, as well as on many other issues, have a very similar political agenda. And that is the danger of this situation, is that yes, the coalition condemned government are making massive cuts to disability benefits, but the Labour Party similarly lay the foundations for many of these cuts to take place. And I haven't seen one Labour politician coming out and saying we will reverse these cuts or we will not make these cuts, because they are following an ideology that would make exactly the same, maybe not quite the same pace or acceleration that this government has, but they are making the same measures. They were making similar measures when they were in government.
Of course, it was Labour that introduced the work capability assessment, which is moving many disabled people off incapacity benefits, and the test was designed badly. But the Labour Party, for the record, did vote against the welfare reform bill when some of the most significant changes included a time limiting of contributions-based employment support allowance and the DLA cut. That's not to say they wouldn't keep them if they came back into power, but they did vote against them in Parliament. But I think more generally, I think the 2 million disabled people reported being a victim of hate crime in 2009-2010, and about 3/4 of disabled people can name a newspaper story that they think has led to a rise in hostility towards those people. That's the kind of change that we want to see as a result of the Paralympics. If we can see in a couple of years, if we can see some of the hate crime figures either being translated into the convictions, an improvement in the conviction rate for people committing hate crimes, and if we can see a change in press coverage of these issues, that will be a more lasting legacy from what has been a very positive Paralympics.
You're tuned to The Voice of Russia. I'm Howell Davis, and you're listening to today's debate. Today we're discussing the Paralympic Games and how they've changed perceptions towards disability in the UK. I'm joined by Neil Coyle of Disability Rights UK, Jodie McIntyre, a journalist and author of the Life on Wheels blog, and Jonathan Friedland, a Guardian columnist. There were surveys before the Paralympics saying that basically the disabled people were frightened of going out on the street, and they blamed the media cover of this. They were being labelled as scroungers, as people who were living off the state. And you think that narrative has basically been changed?
I'm saying that what we'd like to see at Disability Rights UK is a change. It's too soon to say whether we'll see that. I think that when some of the most pernicious cuts start to take effect and disabled people start losing the support that means they can participate in communities, can continue in work, when those cuts start coming through, including to disability living allowance, we'll see a change in the general portrayal in the media, because and there have been a couple of isolated examples already where, for example, a veteran, someone who'd fought, I think, in Afghanistan, who'd been refused a particular bit of support, and the press turns the coverage into this man should get support. And it's the good disabled, the deserving disabled person against the scrounger, which has been where most of the press has been for the last few years. If we see, as more disabled people are affected, in particular from next year from the DLA change, if we see the press change to a more supportive attitude and working out that actually disabled people do need support to level the playing field and to make society more equal, to make opportunities more open to all, that will be a more significant legacy.
Jonathan, do you think the press has played a sort of quite unpleasant role until the Paralympics in labelling disabled people as scroungers?
Well, certainly, and you've heard it there from two people who will follow this more closely than I do, and it's certainly true. That's been part of this whole atmosphere against recipients of benefits from, across the board, disabled and non-disabled. So I think that's definitely true. I think, though, that, the press in some ways is quite a sort of crude animal, and after it has devoted front page after front page, and these sort of poster-style front pages, which it did, both during the Olympics and then again, to some people's surprise, during the Paralympics, it just then becomes slightly harder for them to go back to the old position, because in a way they have, as always, following their readers, they picked up that their readers were not in that kind of mood over these last couple of weeks, that they were not seeing disabled people that way, and that they were seeing them in some ways in quite a new way. At that point I was making before about kind of respect rather than slightly more condescending sympathy. And I think that will be very hard for some of those papers to go back to the old position, because now I think there has genuinely been a change of perception by a lot of people. Look, people are human. It takes a big and spectacular event sometimes to change how people perceive things. It would be better if people were persuaded by, just reading sort of policy proposals and reading blogs and all of that. That's what should change their mind. But people are not always moved by that, and they are moved. They have been shifted by what they've seen, and that will have an impact. And I spoke to lots of people in the Olympic Park who admitted with some degree of embarrassment that it's taken this for their eyes to be opened. Now, we can scold those people, say they should have realised it before, or we could welcome the change and build on it. And I think that will be true of the people. I think that will be true of readers, and what newspapers do is follow their readers. I think now there's been a shift in perception, perhaps long overdue. I think newspapers will follow it, and I think I'm completely with Neil on this. I think it'll be fascinating to see those figures in future. Will they bear out that this was just some kind of blip and everyone goes back to how they were, or will something more profound have changed? And we won't know that till we see those figures.
Jodie, what would convince you there had been a real sea change in attitudes, do you think? You seem very sceptical. I'm just wondering what would convince you that perhaps there had been change?
I'm sceptical because the fact is that we are living in a society that encourages inequality and encourages discrimination. That is not just against disabled people, it's against single mothers, Muslims, young people, ethnic minorities, immigrants. All of these people are victims, if you like, of discrimination in this country. What would signal to me that there has been a change is an actual change. It's very simple. What would signal there's a change is an actual change. So if these measures that I'm talking about were reversed, that would be a change. If we woke up tomorrow morning, or if we woke up next year and the public transport system, I'm only talking about London, the capital. I'm not talking about the whole country, just London. If the public transport system was accessible so that all Londoners could use it, as I'm sure everyone would agree that it should be, then that would be an actual change. So it's very simple. What would signal to me a change is if I saw a change. I haven't seen a change. I don't think a spectacular event changes the situation. I think it can contribute, but it's a much longer process to challenge these deep-seated issues.
Jonathan, you were trying to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, of course, that would be the proof that there had been the full process of change. But the stage in between is that public opinion then demand those changes, that they demand better access, that they demand the government reverse the benefit cuts.
Yes.
That requires public, popular pressure from people more than just the hardcore of disabled activists who've always heroically been engaged in this issue, but from a massive public opinion. And that is itself a change. That's how politics works.
Yeah,
First of all, there's the demand. Then you have to get public allies and support and backing, and then government eventually respond. And so if we move from the initial demand for better access, etc., made by the disabled activists and disabled rights groups, now being backed by a majority of public opinion, that's a big thing, even if it then takes a while to actually get the access improved and to get the government to react to the public opinion shift. So I'm not saying the policy has changed overnight. That's the magic wand argument. I'm saying public opinion has itself now moved, and that could be a great opportunity for the kind of work Neil and Jodie and others are engaged in.
Yes, but the problem is that in the United Kingdom, the government do not respond to public demand, and we've seen this many times. When our government wanted to launch an illegal war in Iraq, over 1 million people demanded, as you are saying, that didn't happen, and it did happen. And the reason these things happen is because none of the three major political parties in this country offer an alternative. So it's a good thing. It's a great thing. It's a thing I support if this does change public perceptions, and I'm sure it will. But our government do not respond to public demand. That's what we've seen.
Okay, fine. This is all we have time for, so perhaps just a closing word to Neil.
Linked to the point Jodie was making, one of the issues that wasn't touched on was poverty. And a third of disabled people live in poverty in the UK. Some of the Paralympians have already spoken out about the need for direct financial support from government in order to have been able to compete. For example, I think one of the figures was $3,500 for one of the wheelchairs used by some of the Paralympians. That higher cost issue needs to be better understood. If we could get some of the Paralympians speaking more about those higher cost of living, the routine, essential higher cost of living that disabled people experience, as a means of challenging the perception that benefits are misused and aren't actually supporting disabled people to go into work and achieve for Team GB even, then that's another Paralympic legacy that we would hope to see, I think.
I'm sorry, that's all we have time for. So thank you very much to Neil Coyle, Director of Policy and Campaigns at Disability Rights UK, Jodie McIntyre, journalist and author of the Life on Wheels blog, and Jonathan Freeland on the line. He's Guardian columnist. Thank you all very much indeed for taking part. You're tuned to The Voice of Russia. I'm Howell Davis, and you're listening to today's debate. Last Sunday night, the closing ceremony of the Paralympic Games was held, marking the end of Britain's spectacular Olympic summer. While the impact of the able-bodied Olympics may have been expected, the popularity of the Paralympics perhaps came as more of a surprise, with record crowds, record TV audiences, and widespread admiration for the efforts of the athletes themselves. So have the Games changed perceptions towards disability for good in the UK? To answer that question, I'm joined now by Neil Coyle, Director of Policy and Campaigns at Disability Rights UK, Jodie McIntyre, journalist and author of the Life on Wheels blog, and Jonathan Freedland, a Guardian columnist. If I might start with you, Neil, do you think these games might have a permanent effect on British ideas of disability?
We very much hope so, Disability Rights UK, and obviously there was an absolutely fantastic reaction to GB hosting the Paralympics. The first time sales for Paralympic sports events have sold out. The public reaction has been absolutely fantastic. We genuinely hope there's a full legacy there. We've produced a London 2012 guide to making sports more accessible generally, that it seems to be very popular online. We hope that'll last. We hope sports clubs will change how they make their premises and events accessible to disabled people as spectators as well as participants. So we are hopeful that there'll be a positive reaction, and including in how society generally sees disabled people, taking away the idea that all disabled people are somehow inherently vulnerable. You cannot watch wheelchair rugby and make that assumption any longer.
Jodie, do you worry that this will be a one-off thing and the impact will fade over time quite quickly?
I think the Paralympics were hugely positive. Own figures, not by my opinion, by their own figures, only 0.3% of applications are fraudulent. And we also have a situation where, whilst we are living in one of the most diverse cities in the world that hosted the Paralympics, let's have a look at our public transport system. Most train stations and tube stations are completely inaccessible. So if you're a disabled person living in London and you wanted to go and watch these amazing Paralympics that we were hosting, you wouldn't even be able to get onto the tube if you wanted to go and watch them. So I think it's better to focus on the concrete reality.
Jonathan, do you think there's a danger in which we're too self-congratulatory about this? There's a golden glow about the Games and we're not actually dealing with the concrete issues that Jodie has just outlined?
There's certainly that danger, that you do just have this sort of warm bath of good feeling and say, right, tick, we've done that. We're obviously a terribly enlightened society, and aren't we great? And then you forget about the really concrete issues that Jodie has rightly alerted us to. And when I wrote about this, I did make some of those points, that the discrimination hasn't gone away, that benefits are being cut, that access in London in particular is said to be terrible. So all of that's true. But what I would say is, in order to get change on exactly those points, the disabled rights movement and activists need allies. And what the Paralympic Games may have done, and the public reaction to the Paralympic Games, is to have woken up a whole lot of people who otherwise may have either been unaware or frankly not interested in these issues to now.
Event. It was amazing to see the best of disabled athletes from all over the world competing. However, it would be naive to suggest that attitudes towards disabilities and prejudice towards disabled people is going to end after 11 days of sporting events. And what is really important to consider is, after the mass hysteria, if you like, of the Olympics and Paralympics has died down, what is the concrete reality of the situation that disabled people face in England and the UK? Today, we have a situation where the government wants to cut 20% of disability benefits, when by their own